Operation Desert Storm. The United States and the coalition forces faced the formidable challenge of conducting a ground war in the hot, arid expanses of the Kuwaiti and Iraqi deserts. And although the business of warfare has gone through monumental changes in the past 50 years, one aspect of waging a surface war remains as essential in the 90s as it did in the 40s: the mobility of troops, weapons, and supplies. The Humvee represents the modern-day solution to that military component. With four-wheel drive and the power and maneuverability to cover open distances quickly over hostile terrain, the Humvee is one of the key transportation devices in use today in America's military arsenal. But the critical role the Humvee plays could only have been made possible by the vehicle that preceded it: a short, stubby, and simple conjunction of unsophisticated parts and pieces, which when cobbled together, created a vehicle of legendary proportions. The Jeep revolutionized the tactics of combat and the future of civilian transportation almost overnight. One part truck, one part automobile, one part tractor, one part swamp buggy. The Jeep's unique abilities, born from its original mission to fulfill the broad needs of an army on the move, make its story one of daring ingenuity, bold corporate opportunism, and stubborn patriotism. The Jeep, the unstoppable soldier. World War I, despite its nickname as the war to end all wars, was not to be the last time great armies from great sovereign powers would take up arms. The immense numbers of dead and wounded that grimly increased with each day of that bitter conflict emphasized the staggering toll that any war commands. And regardless of the outcome, all wars have served the undeniable purpose of teaching its adversaries how best to win the next one. One of the lasting lessons that Allied armies had learned during the First World War was that relying on the horse or mule for transporting men, weapons, or supplies in the battlefield was at best inefficient and at worst unworkable. What had served adequately in previous wars was now painfully inadequate in what was becoming the dawning age of mechanized warfare.
The problem they had was not only were they slow and inefficient, but when they were fighting, it took one man to hold the horse while another man was fighting and shooting the gun. So it was terribly inefficient. Not only that, you had to bring supplies up to the horses, oats, hay, veterinary supplies, in addition to supplies for the men. So, you know, it got terribly inefficient for the Army to continue that way. They were looking for some way to modernize and mechanize.
The job of reconnaissance or scouting was also a vital military task, which up until then was conducted largely on foot or on horseback. Some 20,000 Model Ts were used by American forces for reconnaissance duty during World War I, but not entirely suited to perform all they were asked to, in part because of their standard two-wheel drive. They failed to supply the ultimate answer to the battlefield mobility that the Army sorely needed. Motorcycles had also been tried with limited success, but the uncertain geography of a wartime theater quickly revealed the motorcycle's weaknesses. As early as 1910, some years before World War I, the American military had experimented with inexpensive but agile field vehicles at several Army installations, including the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland and Fort Riley in Kansas. This 1911 Hupmobile, stripped to almost the bare chassis, represented the state-of-the-art in all-purpose military vehicle technology being pursued by a handful of automobile manufacturers at that time. And as the imminent warning shots of World War II were echoing from Central Europe and the Pacific Rim, American military leaders were convinced a battle-ready multi-purpose vehicle would soon be a necessity.
Marmon Harrington tried to get into the business. They had a four-wheel drive truck at the time. The problem they had was that it was was a very robust design. It was made for use in the field, in the farms. It was very heavy, and it would tend to get stuck in any kind of sand or mud, that sort of thing. So, you know, they needed something that was lightweight, four-wheel drive, and with some power to the wheels.
Captain Robert Howie and Master Sergeant Melvin Wiley from the Fort Benning, Georgia Infantry School designed and built another possible answer to the Army's need for field mobility. It was called the Howie Belly Flopper.
The belly flopper was a unique vehicle. It had tiller steering in the rear, small four-cylinder engine to drive it. The way you drove it is you laid down prone. In other words, like you were shooting a rifle laying down. And you drove it by steering it with your feet, basically. And you had a rifle or machine gun on it. And it only stood about 24 inches off the ground, so it had a very low silhouette. The problem with it is that it had no springs or shocks. So you were laying down there getting your insides beat out of you as you went over any kind of terrain, not alone rough terrain. Just going over a parking lot today would be enough to give you severe rib injuries. Obviously, it didn't get very far.
During the 1930s, the American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania, was building small economical coupes and roadsters. In 1938, Bantam's owner, Roy Evans, offered the Pennsylvania National Guard 2 American Bantam roadsters to use during their annual summer maneuvers. Weighing only 1,000 pounds, the Bantams favorably impressed the Guardsmen with their taut handling and spirited performance. This would be the first small step in bringing Bantam and the U.S. military into an eventful relationship with enormous historical impact. Adolf Hitler's brutal sweep through Central Europe was the major focus of American military scrutiny during much of 1939. One of the more sardonic jokes being passed around U.S. Army bases claimed that Hitler had just ordered 1,000 tanks from General Motors, but rather than have them delivered, he just picked them up on the way through. With American involvement in European hostilities now almost a foregone conclusion, the Army took steps to equip itself with whatever hardware was necessary to ensure victory, including a go-anywhere light reconnaissance vehicle, or LRV. On June 27, 1940, the Army's Ordnance Technical Committee agreed on a list of specifications it felt would define the basic size and capabilities of the LRV it was looking for. Of the 17 major specifications listed, including four-wheel drive, one of the most off-putting was the initial weight limit, a mere 1,200 pounds, later raised to 1,300. This was roughly half the weight of the production automobiles being built by Detroit in the 1930s.
What the Ordnance Department decided they needed was a clean sheet approach. So what they did is they outlined specifications for this Jeep vehicle, if you will, and what they called it was a truck 1/4 ton 4x4. The weight was supposed to be 1,300 pounds with a 600-pound payload. Those were the basic descriptors of the original contract that went out for the quote of the vehicles.
During the 30s, Americans had shown a strong appetite for large, roomy, powerful automobiles, and few manufacturers were devoting their energies toward the design and development of lightweight vehicles. Another specification dictated by the Army was equally daunting. A running pilot car would have to be delivered to Camp Holabird in Baltimore, Maryland in only 49 days. 135 letters of intent were sent to the automotive industry at large, inviting any and all interested builders to compete for the startup contract worth $175,000 for an initial run of 70 vehicles. The unheard-of specifications and stringent time limit were enough to keep all but 2 companies from responding to the challenge: Willys Overland in Toledo, Ohio, and the American Bantam Car Company. Bantam claimed it could meet the specifications and have the pilot vehicle delivered in 49 days. Willys Overland was less sure and was granted an extension to 120 days to deliver their prototype. What happened next is an involved cross-current of personal initiative and political intrigue that would center around 2 men: Carl Probst of Bantam and Barney Roos of Willys Overland.
Well, Carl Probst was an independent contractor hired by Bantam to do the design of this Jeep vehicle. It wasn't called a Jeep then, of this early reconnaissance car. He was given the task to design it. He did the basic design in 5 days and built the first prototype in 49 days. That's the Blitz buggy that was driven out to Camp Hollibird for the original testing. He is the undisputed father of the Jeep, if you will. That fact has never been in dispute, although Barney Roos and Carl Probst got into some heated discussions over that. Barney Roos was the chief engineer at Willys Overland Motor Company. He was in charge of the basic design of all of the Willys Overland cars at the time. And he was a chief engineer extraordinaire. He was very adept at solving any type of problems. He was also an engineer's engineer. He would get his hands dirty and dig into the problems and understand what made things tick and what needed to be improved.
The importance of winning the Army contract for Bantam was not lost on Carl Probst. Bantam was in failing financial health, so much so that Probst was hired on spec, meaning that he would only be paid if his design of the LRV was chosen by the Army. The pressure of meeting the government specifications and the time limit was now further exacerbated by what appeared to be a life-or-death scenario facing Bantam. Behind the scenes at the Pentagon, military decision-makers questioned amongst themselves whether Bantam, which now operated with a limited production facility, could meet the volume requirements the Army would be looking at should Bantam's LRV design win the contract. And so, while Carl Probst was scouring the parts bins at Bantam to adapt existing Bantam components to his emerging design, the Army was asking the Ford Motor Company to join the search for a workable light reconnaissance vehicle.
You got to understand there were several factions within the various divisions of government saying Bantam couldn't supply enough vehicles. They only had 450 people total. Willys Overland had 5,000 people in total. Ford Motor Company had 100,000. So there are various different sizes of corporations you're dealing with here. The government didn't feel Bantam could supply in any quantity the vehicles that they were requiring. So they were going behind the scenes and encouraging both Ford and Willys Overland to submit their vehicles, and they would be considered for testing, even though they were late.
Back in Pennsylvania, Probst was joined by Bantam employees Frank Fenn, Harold Christ, and a small team of associates who would assist in the acquisition of component parts and oversee assembly once the time came for actual construction of the prototype. But before they could reach that point, it would be entirely up to Probst to create a successful design that had been granted little room for error.
Carl had an exceptionally large staff. It included him, himself, and no one else. He basically did it on a drawing board about the size of my desk over a weekend. You know, once you laid out the basic drivetrain, you threw a body around it, and he didn't have a lot of emissions controls to worry about, or airbags or seat belts. You know, you were basically just sitting out there. The only seat belt they had was a canvas webbing that went from one side of the door post to the other just to make sure you didn't fall out. There wasn't a lot on the vehicle. He did it all.
Once Probst had drawn up blueprints for the Bantam LRV, the Army would need to review them and give the go-ahead for a prototype. The blueprints received quick approval from the military, but unbeknownst to Probst and his colleagues, they were then forwarded to Willys Overland and Ford to help speed up the development of their designs. As the Bantam prototype took shape in the summer of 1940, it was a model of engineering simplicity. A sturdy frame with only 2 crossmembers on an 80-inch wheelbase, Spicer axles including a rear unit based on a Studebaker Champion production differential, and a 42-horsepower Continental engine, which offered more power than Bantam's own in-house engine, comprised the platform for the new LRV. The body was a hasty fusion of raw sheet metal and junkyard cast-offs, including a hood fashioned from a discarded trunk lid. 47 days after putting pencil to paper, the Bantam team rolled their Blitz buggy into the light of day for the first time. 2 days later, on September 23, 1940, after sharing the driving duties on the 230-mile trip from Pennsylvania, Carl Probst and Harold Christ arrived at Camp Holabird in the Bantam Blitz buggy, some 30 minutes before the Army's 49-day time limit expired. The new LRV was submitted for testing before a panel of Army brass and the critical eyes of representatives from the other competing manufacturers. With little, if any, field testing behind it, the Bantam prototype was subjected to a battery of rugged, relentless tests, designed to uncover any structural weaknesses or design flaws the compact vehicle might be suffering from. Passing each test with flying colors, it appeared that the Blitz buggy had won the Army over, until the question of the vehicle's overall weight threatened to end Bantam's hopes of winning the production contract.
The interesting thing in this story is that when the original specifications went out, the vehicle was to weigh no more than 1,350 pounds. Bantam's prototype weighed in at 1,800 pounds, and that was some of the reluctance of the other car companies to submit bids. No one knew how to build a car to meet those strict weight requirements. Even today, we have a hard time meeting, weight requirements of that magnitude. They got a little, once they saw what the vehicle could do, the general sat around, deciding, and they said, don't worry about that. We'll put it down as a typo. It'll slide through the system. As long as 4 men can pick it up out of a ditch, we'll consider it an acceptable weight. And they got one strong sergeant to go over, and he basically lifted it out by himself. He said, that's fine, we'll take it. So it kind of is what set the stage for the weight requirement. And they basically weighed the Blitz buggy and said, that's the weight requirement, 1,850 pounds.
3 more weeks of heavy-handed testing revealed that the Bantam design was on target. If a part or system on the Blitz buggy did fail during testing, Army mechanics found they could be repaired easily. Bantam was given the green light to build a total of 72 Blitz buggies for further Army evaluation. But the exceptional performance of the Bantam prototype had not escaped the interests of Willys Overland. With Bantam's blueprints in hand, Barney Roos went about the task of building his prototype, adopting much of the basic design methodology he found in the Bantam blueprints. On November 13, 1940, the completed Willys prototype, designated the Willys Quad, was delivered to the Army. Not surprisingly, the Willys Quad bore a striking resemblance to the Bantam Blitz buggy, much to the indignation of Carl Probst and his team. The Army, claiming that these new vehicles were their property, asserted that they could share their designs with whomever they pleased. Not wanting to jeopardize a lucrative government contract, Probst and Bantam chose not to force the issue. Although similar to the Blitz buggy in appearance, the Willys Quad benefited from several improvements, which Barney Roos had included to overcome a number of the Bantam vehicle's most egregious shortcomings. Barney chose the Willys Go Devil engine, a production unit from the Willys automobile that boasted more power and torque than Bantam's Continental engine. The Quad was stronger and more substantial in overall construction, which ultimately led, however, to a problem for Roos, the same problem which had confronted Carl Probst and the Blitz buggy. The Quad was seriously overweight.
The problem that the Willys Overland Barney Roos had was that they were somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,100 pounds. They were 300 pounds overweight. They had to take their vehicle and go back because the new specification said it can't weigh more than 1,850 pounds. They went back and looked at cotter keys, length of bolts. They cut bolts down. They shaved excess weight off of parts. They even went so far as to specify just 1 coat of paint on the vehicle because 2 would put it over the spec. When they got done, they were actually under 7 ounces to the weight requirement, so they cut it pretty close.
Meanwhile, Ford had little legwork to do in designing and fabricating their LRV. By now, Bantam and Willys Overland had shown the way. All that was left for Ford to do was build a derivative of what the Army had already seen and endorsed. The Ford GPW, soon to be called the GP, completed the triumvirate of LRVs that would be called upon to fulfill the Army's needs for a multi-purpose 4x4. Based heavily on its two predecessors, the GP, under agreement with Willys, would ultimately come equipped with the more powerful Willys engine, rather than the agricultural Fordson tractor engine originally used in the first prototypes. The Army had stipulated that all three manufacturers were to adhere to design uniformity that allowed easy interchangeability of parts. But Henry Ford, stubbornly determined to maintain some semblance of individuality in his products, ordered that each and every part in the Ford GP bear the letter F, right down to each nut and bolt.
No one came close in the weight department. Everyone came close in meeting the payload. They were all obviously quarter-ton 4x4s. They all used basically Dana axles, different engines, different transmissions, and they had pretty much the same basic layout. 2 seats, driver, steering wheel, hood. They met those requirements. They got a little more complex in the next round of negotiations. They got very specific about different generators, alternators, an axe and a shovel had to be added, driving the weight up, but those were all things that the Army wanted to make them more useful out in the field.
By March 1941, with war now engulfing most of Europe and the specter of Japanese aggression erupting on the other side of the Pacific, the Army pushed ahead its timetable for having its supply of LRVs up to operational levels. During extensive head-to-head testing at Army installations, where Army personnel were now putting the LRVs through their paces, the Bantam Blitz Buggy, the Willys Overland Quad, and the Ford GP were performing admirably. But before the Army was prepared to offer the volume contract for mass production of its LRVs, it would contract with each manufacturer to build a shorter run of 1,500 units. Bantam delivered 1,175 Blitz buggies within months, many of them shipped overseas under the Lend-Lease agreement with Russia and Britain. By the end of the year, Bantam would deliver close to 2,700 LRVs to the Army. However, it would be the largest order for their revolutionary vehicle that Bantam would ever receive from the military. Barney Roos continued to upgrade the Willys Quad, which by now had evolved into the model designation MA. And the MA was quickly winning strong favor with the military establishment.
The Willys was the favorite among the troops because of its engine's power. It could do more things, get out of places quicker, had less breakdowns, and a lot of that we attribute to the fact that Bernie Roos had a policy developing an engine that you had to run at 100 hours, wide open throttle nonstop without anything breaking. That's how it was developed. You think about that, you can have a little more robust design in the engine. But look at what Ford did. They took a basic Fordson tractor engine and put that in. It was used to running on a governor, so it's a constant speed, low RPM. That's what its engine was designed for. Bantam just went out and purchased an off-the-shelf engine from the Continental Motor Company. So the engine is by far and away the biggest part of the Jeep vehicle, and that's what the GIs were so impressed about. It's lightweight, high horsepower, and you could certainly move with it.
With the GIs, the Willys seemed to be more popular. It broke down less frequently. They were more comfortable, easier to drive. They were easier to get in and out of. And when you're loaded down with 80 pounds of gear, getting in and out of a vehicle becomes important. But also, many men claimed they liked the Willys better because you could cannibalize parts from a disabled Willys and use them to restore a partially destroyed Jeep and save that Jeep and reclaim it. They liked the fact that the parts were very quickly and easily removed from damaged Jeeps. This was basically the reason why, from my experience, the Willys was the more favorable, the more popular Jeep.
It was now up to the Army to award the mass production order. Ford and Willys, by now the clear frontrunners, had submitted bids with the expectation that one of them would be awarded the hefty government contract. But the Army wasn't completely sold on any one of the three designs set before them. None of them, at least in the eyes of the military, were perfect. And with questions persisting about Bantam's ability to meet the Army's production requirements, it appeared that the bids submitted by Willys and Ford would be the deciding factors on who would land the deal.
An interesting thing was, at the very end of the bidding and the volume contract, there was a fourth bidder that came in most people aren't aware of. That was a Checker Cab Company. They had a bid, actually they were the low bidder, somewhere around $700, but they were completely disregarded because they had never provided a prototype in any of the testing, and therefore they weren't qualified to bid on this. They kind of threw them out as a latecomer. But that gives you some indication of the range. It usually went from $700 to $780 is the bid on the vehicles for that volume contract.
Ultimately, corporate squabbling and the Army's desire to double source the project would make winners of both Willys and Ford.
The Army issued bids to all three of the respondents for 15,000 vehicles for extended testing throughout different theaters, also to start developing different strategic plans as to how you would use the Jeep vehicle in wartime. Once they went through that testing, the Army got together and said, this isn't quite what we want. We like some features from each. They like the fenders and hood from the Ford. They love the engine, the power they got from the engine out of the Willys. And Bantam had some unique features as well that they want to incorporate. So they rewrote all the specifications and called it an MB. That's what went out and was quoted. When it came back, Willys Overland was the winner in that. They were awarded the contract to build 100,000 or so units at that point in time. Ford Motor Company contested it. It went back and forth several times, again, because of the differing factions on who was best capable of producing these amount of vehicles. Ended up, both Ford and Willys produced the vehicles. Ford, under license from Willys, they basically copied everything that Willys had designed up to that point, including the engine.
Despite popular belief, Bantam's inability to land the volume contract from the Army did not lead to their immediate bankruptcy. The war had provided Bantam with a profitable source of income from the production of cargo trailers, torpedo motors, and aircraft landing gear, helping the small Pennsylvania company to survive until ending production in 1956. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor abruptly launched the United States into World War II. With the standardization of the Army's newest vehicle now achieved, serious production of this multi-talented workhorse could begin. The Willys MB, reworked and refined by Barney Roos, brought the previous model, the MA, to the level of battlefield readiness the Army had been looking for.
And the differences that they had identified they wanted to see in this new MB was a new type of air filter. It was common with the other vehicles they had out in the field. A 6-volt, 40-amp generator, a 15-gallon fuel tank in place of the 10, a military-type battery. The handbrake was moved from the center, to the center from the Ford design because they liked that. You could get to it from either seat. If someone was shot, you could easily pull the handbrake from the passenger seat as well. The double hoop top support from Willys, they liked that because otherwise the top tended to droop down right over your head as you were driving. It didn't tend to keep the water off you as well. Combat lighting with blackout lights, modification of steering column and brakes, shock absorbers, and of course the ever-present Pioneer tools consisting of the axe and shovel. That's what became the MB, and that's what they went into production with.
The General Purpose Vehicle, or GPV, as it was now commonly called, would find its way into the hands of thousands of enlisted men and officers in every branch of the military, both on the home front and overseas. And its nomenclature, GPV, was soon to be replaced by the name it would carry forever after.
We were told that they were designated as a GPV, General Purpose Vehicle. Well, as with everything else in the military, they abbreviate. And they dropped the V for vehicle and kept the GP. And for a long time it was called a GP. And pretty soon that was shortened to just be Jeep. And as far as I know, that's how it got its name. Just like OD and GI was government issue, OD was olive drab. Everything was by initials in those days.
That's probably the most talked about subject when you talk about Jeeps. You've got Eugene the Jeep, there's the Jeep Moline tractor, there's the GP contraction from GP, which by the way was a Ford designation and didn't come until after the vehicle had been designed into production. We'll probably never know where the Jeep name came from. The first time it was ever mentioned in print, though, was when Red Hausman, a test driver at the time, took one of the reporters up the Capitol steps in a Jeep. And he took her down through one of the parks as well, down through the ravine and up the other side. And when he pulled to a stop, there were some reporters around. They asked him what the name of that thing was, and he just hung on the steering wheel and said, "It's a Jeep." It's the first time it's ever been in print, and from thereafter, you know, it just took off. No one will ever know the real way the Jeep name came about.
In May of 1964, in a Jeep promotional film produced by WTOL-TV in Toledo, Red Hausman himself was asked how the Jeep name was born.
Jeep. Red, you are credited as being the man who got the name Jeep started in the public press and so forth, but where did you first hear the name? Was it used around the plant as they were building this vehicle?
No, it was not. It was used at Camp Hollifer.
That's where it was tested?
That's right.
And how did it come about?
It was used on a command car at the time, and it was a matter of differentiating between the three models on tests.
Mm-hmm.
And I just asked to have ours called a Jeep.
Uh-huh.
And one was called a Bantam, and one was called a Ford.
Yeah. And some of the reporters started using it. That's how it all got started, I guess.
In print, yes.
With war plant production at maximum output, Jeeps were being built at the rate of 300 per day. Between 1941 and 1945, Ford and Willys would produce a combined total of over 600,000 Jeeps.
Willys Motors ended up building in the neighborhood of 357,849 military Jeeps. Fears of sabotage led to dual sourcing with Ford, and Ford built an additional 290,151 Jeeps. The difference being Ford built that number of Jeeps at 5 different manufacturing plants. Willys Motors built all of those right here in this facility that you're in today. Every one of them came off this assembly line. So, you know, they built a lot of them in many different sites. Willys built all 350,000 right here on this site.
It was a matter of total mobilization. Children collected rubber, collected aluminum, collected steel. Women went into the factories and worked. They left their homes. The support of the war effort was just astounding, and it was overnight. And this ability, this what I call the productive genius of the American, is what I think was the deciding factor in the winning of the war on two fronts.
We loaded a lot of everything, obviously, for the combat zone. Vehicles were a part of the assignment, and Jeeps obviously were a part of the vehicles that were loaded on the ships. A big part. Jeeps were a tremendous part. And we had as many, as I recall, as many as 15 piers where ships were being loaded 24 hours a day. And these vehicles, for the most part, would be placed on the decks of each ship, and with cables would be strapped down, obviously, to prevent losing them at sea.
Willys Overland was the low bidder on the volume contract of around $732. So they were pretty cheap in relative terms back then. Compared to a tank, they were around $35,000, as I recall. And you can get a lot more people. They were expendable. You know, if you blow one up, you just go get another one. They were producing them in such quantities that supply was not a problem.
Literally thousands. We shipped, each ship contained a number of vehicles, all types of combat vehicles, from smaller pickup trucks to heavy-duty weapons carriers to and included Jeeps. The Jeeps were a big part of the shipment to the combat zone. As to how many there were that I recall, I honestly couldn't put a number except to say that it had to be thousands, literally thousands and thousands of Jeeps. They were small, they were compact, they could be placed anywhere and everywhere that the space was available on the ship, and they were utilized for that purpose.
This country, it's amazing. production facilities caught up so quickly to the Germans and the Japanese. And the Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, I think it was, he was against the war. He was against this Japanese Pearl Harbor, but he was outvoted, and he said that you're waking up the sleeping giant. And he was right. Our production just was unbelievable to this day, how they switched over so fast.
We would hoist these vehicles onto the deck. When the ship was firmly loaded and the holes were sealed, they would then begin to load the decks themselves and with cables tie them down. And they were loading this series of vehicles, including Jeeps. And at one point there, they had this Jeep raised up above the pier, and the cable snapped. And this Jeep actually fell to the pier on its four wheels from a distance of perhaps 30 feet. And of course, it caused a great amount of activity, in as much as there was the fear of somebody being hurt, but there wasn't. The first reaction was that the car was totally destroyed, but when they examined it, somebody put the ignition on and just drove it back to the motor pool.
From the moment the Jeep and the GI first met, it was love at first sight. Even before distinguishing itself in the war zone, Jeeps were the most popular means for both officer and enlisted man to shuttle around military bases. Despite their lack of creature comforts and their stark utilitarian appearance, the Jeep's willingness to serve and its dogged ability to adapt to most any job soon made it much more than the sum of its parts.
The Jeeps were, of course, the first time we ran across them were in basic training in Alabama. And they were used basically to carry non-commissioned officers and officers from one point of the base to the other. They were loud, they were hard riding, but they did everything.
The car was initially commissioned to be a 1/4 ton reconnaissance scout car. It would go ahead of the troops, scout out what was there, report back, radio in findings, just to kind of get out and see what's going on. Once the GIs got it in the field, they were instrumental in outfitting that to do many tasks. They put stretchers on it to haul wounded back from the front. They were putting barbed wire rolls on the back of it to lay down barbed wire fences, cables for telephone lines. Throw a plow in the back. You could dig a trench and put a plow on the front, and you can cover the trench over for early communication lines. Buses, trains. They even outfitted some with half tracks and made a early snowmobile out of it, if you will, with some skis on the front of it. It did just about everything they asked for. If you wrapped it in a tarpaulin, you could paddle it across a river. So river crossings, if they were too deep to ford through, you could just paddle across them. So, they, given the GIs a little inch there, they took it a long way and made a lot of usefulness out of the vehicle. In some cases, it became the chapel. You cover the hood of it, and you have your altar for the Sunday services. So it had a lot of uses out in the field.
Blessed with a powerful, reliable drivetrain and scrappy four-wheel drive, the Jeep was soon the subject of countless stories of its incredible toughness and versatility in both the steaming jungles of the South Pacific and the deep snows of the northern frontiers.
First time I drove a Jeep was in the Battle of the Bulge. We were told to drive trucks, we were told to drive everything but tanks. And my first time, if my memory is correct, was when we were starting to evacuate some sections of the city of March, where we had finally managed to blunt or stop the westward push by Gerd von Rundstedt and the German forces. And we were evacuating food supplies and ammunition to a safer location. I happened to be a mine and booby trap technician with the 84th Rail Splitter Infantry Division. At the time that the bulge broke out on the 16th of December, my division was on the Rohr River on Hitler's west wall, his Siegfried Line. The Americans were so hopelessly outnumbered, 75,000 to 500,000 Germans, that all available troops in America, England, France, southern France, Italy, Germany, Holland, were being brought to try and stem this awesome offensive by Hitler's forces. We were transported in 6x6 troop carriers all night long, wound up in the city of March, and from that point all hell broke loose. All sorts of confusion broke loose. Command broke down, communications broke down, supply lines broke down, morale broke down, everything broke down. It was hopeless confusion for at least 2 weeks of the 6 weeks of that campaign. Pretty much most of the vehicles broke down due to the severe 40 degree below zero temperatures, and for the most part waist-deep snow, which turned eventually to sheer ice. From the 5th day of the bulge until the end was blizzard-like conditions with gale-force winds. Tanks slid off of roads and into ditches and could not operate. Ambulances couldn't get through the snow. 3/4-ton weapons carriers, recon vehicles, troop carriers were bogged down in the snow. But the Jeep was able to still move. With its four-wheel drive and its remarkable capabilities, it managed to keep going. And it was used for just practically everything.
Depending upon what theater you're going into, you could airlift them over. Typically, when they had many of them, they were packed into a crate that was roughly 4 foot wide, 3 foot high, and about 8 foot long. So you could stack several of them on a ship going overseas. Once you got them there, you could get them there any way you could. On train, you'd load them up on a train for long distances, or they actually outfitted them with parachutes, dropped them from the large planes or gliders, and they'd roll out with the troops going to their assigned position. So they got there in a lot of ways.
I'm told that in the Southwest Pacific, the Jeep performed in the sand where men couldn't march. And I think it was universal, the affection that the military forces, Marines, Air Corps, all of them had for the Jeep. It was just universal.
There's a story about the Navy. You never parked your Army Jeep near a dock where a Navy ship was on. A hook would come down and move it while you're having your lunch or something. And within an hour, the Navy'd have it back on the dock painted like our Navy Jeep here, gray.
The GIs felt that was one of the things that endeared them back to the States. Their vehicle. America is America on wheels. They're very attached to their vehicles. People would go so far as to pop the distributor cap on the vehicles and switch to spark plug wires. I believe it was 1 in 4, and the vehicle would start and idle, but you couldn't drive it anywhere, just so they'd make sure their vehicle wouldn't get away from them. They were always cannibalizing parts. If they find one that had an axle left, they'd take that and build the rest of the Jeep out of it from all the other bits and pieces that had been blown apart throughout the rest of the campaign. They were very attached to them, as much as you or I would be to our cars today. We're in the car business. We love cars. It's that kind of an affair.
You must remember that the American male is first of all in love with his vehicle, maybe second with his girlfriend or wife, and maybe third with his supper or his job, but first it's his vehicle. He polishes his vehicle before he does anything for his wife. We are a country whose whole culture is predicated on automobiles, and that love for any type of four-wheel vehicle extended to the GIs. It was a cute vehicle. It was the darling of the military forces. You get a big 10-wheel truck. What's a big 10-wheel truck? You get a treaded weapons carrier or a recon vehicle, big. It's clanking along. It's making all sorts of noise. And then along comes this Rudy Kazooty little vehicle that everyone fell in love with. The GI, it was his favorite vehicle without any doubt whatsoever.
Well, a lot of it has to relate to the GIs. I mean, everyone could relate to a Jeep. Everyone who was anyone was seen in a Jeep. Kings, queens, princes, generals, visiting dignitaries, they always rode, if you notice in the films, they're in the passenger seat front. There's a good reason for that. Many of the Jeeps, if you rode in them for any length of time in the rear, You got a quick case of hemorrhoids, so you didn't want to do it very, very long. So, that was one of the stories that you hear about on the frontiers, and specifically in Europe, was that a lot of the armed sentries, if you drove up in a Jeep and the officers were sitting in the back, they knew they were the enemy, because all officers in America rode in the front because of those problems we just talked about. They could tell if they were impersonating American officers.
The German military machine, whenever it captured Americans, which was during the Bulge with frightening frequency. In fact, in one division they captured intact almost 2 full regiments in the first 4 or 5 days, 3 or 4 days of the Bulge. And the first thing they wanted was the Jeep. They had Kugelwagen, which was a 4-cylinder, rear-wheel drive, 4-passenger Volkswagen that they used almost exclusively to transport their officers to various points on the battlefront. And the Jeep, apparently from the frequency with which they tried to steal and acquire ours, was superior to what they had in their army for that type of vehicle. It was very common to see Germans driving Jeeps with their insignia on it. But however, they stole our Sherman tanks and used them and put swastikas on them too. So anything that could be used, rifles, machine guns, artillery pieces, but they wanted that Jeep.
Some early French resistance fighters, as I recall, were approached by people claiming to be American soldiers trying to get through a checkpoint. The sentry didn't hesitate. He immediately pulled his gun up and shot all 4 of them dead. When asked why he could be so sure they weren't Americans, he said, "That's easy. Everyone knows Americans come in a Jeep."
Historians have, and writers I have read, have said it was the Jeep that won World War II, and to some degree I have to concur.
Ernie Pyle, a war correspondent, had a special relationship with the GIs out in the field, and I've got a quote here I'll read that he wrote concerning the Jeep vehicle. It kind of sums up what the vehicle was doing. "Good Lord, I do not think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. It goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and agile as a goat. All the time it carries twice what it was designed for and still keeps on going. It doesn't even ride so badly after you get used to it. The Jeep is a divine instrument of wartime locomotion." Ernie Pyle.
America's decisive victories over Germany and Japan brought peacetime back to the United States in late 1945. Willys and Ford had more than adequately maintained the supply of military Jeeps to the American and Allied fighting forces. But soon, with the need for Army Jeeps greatly diminished, Ford's eagerness to continue Jeep production would also decline. Willys, now faced with surviving on solely their automobile production, which was barely profitable, saw an opportunity to boost its bottom line.
In 1948, Willys pushed to get the patent on the Jeep name. Ford Motor Company did not contest it at that point in time. The speculation is they were just coming out of the war. People needed cars and trucks. They didn't see much of a market for what we would call today the sport utility market, small 4x4 sport utilities. They didn't put up much of a fight at all. I mean, matter of fact, they didn't contest it at all, and that's one of the reasons the Jeep name is trademarked today, now with Chrysler Corporation, is they stuck with it and kept through all the years.
But the Willys strategy was not geared toward the recreational applications of the Jeep, but rather its agricultural potential. The infinite versatility that the Jeep had shown on the battlefields of Europe and the South Pacific could perhaps be marketed toward the segment of the civilian population that derived its livelihood from farming.
Willys Overland thought they had the Jeep would become a replacement tractor for all of the servicemen coming back from the war. They thought they would want a Jeep in their garage, and what's more, they wanted to do everything that they could when they were overseas. So they outfitted plows to it, threshers, spray painters, compressors, you name it, welders. They had a tool that you could put on the Jeep, and you just back up to it, put a backhoe on it, you can go out and lay a trench. Covered up with the snow blade or the the dozer blade. They had outlined a complete catalog of tools that you could purchase to go with your Jeep. And they envisioned a farmer owning a Jeep. He could plow with it one day, unhook it, go to church, and then pick up his groceries with it, same day.
I was so enamored of the Jeep when I was discharged and came back from Europe in 1946. I served a year of occupation because of a limited knowledge, some knowledge of the German language. I was used as an interpreter and for tracking down war criminals and so forth. But when I came home in 1946, the first thing I did was to buy a Jeep. I bought my Jeep in 46 because of what I had seen it could do in snow in the Bulge, and what it could do in mud in France, Holland, and Germany.
Several of the people on the board of Willys Motors had farms in the area, and so what they would do is they'd have these things developed, some of them by Monroe Auto Equipment, some by other people, Warren Winch, Meyer Snowplow. They would develop these various appliances, attachments if you will, and they would go out and plow 40 acres, run a combine through the fields, just everything they need to do on their farm. They use that on the weekends, and we have pictures showing Ward Canaday and his board of directors out reviewing the progress that they've made with the appliances out in the field. They foresaw that not only in the States here, but overseas in developing countries, newly freed from the aggression of ending the war, would need this type of vehicle. At that point in time, Willys Overland was quite an expansive company, having factories in, I believe, over 50 countries, licensing and building the Jeep vehicles as they existed at the end of the war. So there was a tremendous untapped potential market worldwide for Jeep vehicles and accessories, and they were looking to capitalize on that.
Willys saw limited success with its plan to replace America's venerable tractor with the Jeep. Reluctant to abandon a style of equipment that had served farmers for almost 50 years, the farming community stayed, for the most part, with their traditional agricultural fleet, and the sale of Jeeps failed to show the increases Willys Overland had expected. In 1953, Willys sold its Jeep operation to Kaiser Industries for an estimated $60 million. Kaiser slowly repositioned the Jeep as a new kind of automobile that offered an adventurous image and the ability to go where other vehicles couldn't. The product line was expanded to include more civilian-oriented convertibles and station wagons, as names like Wagoneer and Gladiator Truck became symbols of rugged and dependable transportation. On February 5, 1970, American Motors purchased the Kaiser Jeep Corporation for $70 million.
The king of the hill is about to discover the new Jeep CJ7 with extra room for gear and options like a hardtop and automatic transmission.
It was during the youth-driven decade of the 1970s that the Jeep spearheaded a new wave of vehicular fashion that has gradually become one of the most profitable segments of the world automotive market, the sport utility.
One more time!
It really started to take off when they kind of recognized their niche in that this vehicle could get you into places that most people couldn't go. Out west, Rubicon Trail is a good example. It's a trail that literally takes you 24 hours to go 12 miles. It's not something you're going to do overnight, and there are very few vehicles that can do that. The Jeep vehicle will get you there and get you back without any issue. But that opened up the recreational market, if you will. The people that wanted to go up in the woods on the weekends, go out in the mountains, go fly fishing. It opened that market for them, and that's really when it started to take off in the late 60s, when we started adding some creature comforts to allow them to get to their places in relative comfort as well as safety.
Now owned by the Chrysler Corporation, the Jeep has been retired from its military career and has been replaced by the Humvee, which carries on in a proud tradition that was forged 50 years ago on smoky battlefields and white-hot deserts around the globe. Hurriedly conceived and pieced together from the undignified remains foraged from salvage yards and thrown headlong into the worst conditions that nature and warfare could contrive, the saga of the Jeep is an enduring affirmation of American ingenuity. Second only to Coca-Cola as the world's most identifiable trademark, the Jeep's lasting fame has been well earned.
I guess if you look at everything that's been written and said, it comes down to one or two things. It knows what it is, and it does it quite well. It doesn't put on any appearances or airs. It's meant to be a vehicle that will get you anywhere and do anything.
The Jeep brought supplies to us, ammunition and food to us when other vehicles couldn't. It went places that other vehicles. Now you had a 6x6 troop carrier. You couldn't ask it to go up a mountain unless it had a road. The Jeep could go over piles of stone, it could go over rubble, it could go through swamps, it did everything. And it moved where other vehicles couldn't. It moved where tanks couldn't move. And oh yes, I would have to say that the war would have been prolonged had we not had the Jeep and utilized it as widely as we did. I think an awful lot of men would not have been evacuated or gotten to medical facilities as fast without that Jeep. Oh, it would have had a profound difference on the outcome of the war.
There will always be a Jeep, and it'll probably always exist in not only the minds of the customers, but the people who lived in the past as well.